Governance, and I'll go through the governance quickly, but it's an important one because these are the people.
But they didn't take our churches, no. It wasn't the power of government that did it. It was the power of our own church at the highest level of Anglican leadership on the West Coast. The bishop and his executive council sold our first church 1 month before Hiroshima. They sold it without ever asking us. They sold it without ever telling us truthfully afterwards. The bishop and his executive council sold our second church after we were already coming back to Vancouver, after our 7 years of exile were finally over. In a doubly cruel stroke, Bishop Heathcote and his council sold our last church on the 4th anniversary of the end of the Pacific War in 1949. We had been freed from exile 5 months previously. We never found out the facts until 60 years later. And in his apology, Bishop Michael said, the sale in 1949 of Holy Cross Church was especially insensitive and wrong.
This slide is a good example of the value of the archives. We spent a week in Toronto in the archives. That's where we found this list of Japanese mission workers, December the 1st, 1941, 6 days before Pearl Harbor, and they all went to the camps in interior BC. I won't spend a lot of time on this, but governance, what it tells us is who managed the Japanese missions, and more importantly, those workers. It was an organization called the PPMO, the Provincial Board of Missions for the Orientals. But the important piece of that slide is where did they get their funding from? And if you can see at the bottom there, MSCC, again the Toronto organization, provide money to cover all of the wages. It was about 80% of the money came from Toronto. And by the way, continued to come from Toronto until 1967, when the MSCC, I guess, was disbanded at that time. And you can see the bishops, the dioceses were able to contribute some, but they didn't have a lot to contribute. I'm going to skip through these because I think, Jim, I'm running late, aren't I? These aren't as important. This one I'd just like to quickly cover. The history that's been lost, I think, in the last 50 years is you tend to think of Japanese Canadians and the Diocese in Westminster. What's been lost over time is how for 50 years it was managed and funded from Toronto through the MSCC, and then there was an organization called the PBMO in the middle that in fact provided the supervision and payroll. Lynn and her husband were under the PBMO and not under diocesan payroll, but under PBMO payroll for the first 6 years that they were priests at Holy Cross. Abandonment. I'm going to just quickly go over this one because we're running a little bit late. We'll allow for 2 leadings and I'll come back to this under timing.
What was the intention of Bishop Heathcote and his executive council in selling our churches? Do you think, Nomi, that their intention was that we have nothing to come back to? What could they have possibly been thinking when they wrote in their May 1949 Executive Council minutes, 2 months after our freedom had been granted? The need of Japanese mission work is nil. What was their intention at the time of our return in diverting our hard-earned Japanese Canadian funds into the Bishop's Endowment Fund? The fund used to pay his salary. These are more than moral and ethical issues. Where were their Christian souls? This seems worse than the racial discrimination of government by the military orders and council. This seems like virulent, institutional, provincial racism by our bishop and his executive council, hiding behind closed doors. You know, Professor Fielding of Trinity College saw the truth in 1943, long before any of the detailed truths came out. He didn't seem to be scared to express it either. He accused our church of a travesty of episcopacy. You know your Aunt Emily. If I had known it, I would have said it, but I never knew.
They're saying if you could remember 4 things from this evening, you remember the 3 R's and that date, April the 1st. This next section is about the second R, and it was really the hardest part of the project.
And in his apology, Bishop Michael said, racism is and has been part of our church, and we should confess it and repent of it.
but how do you prove racism? It's the most difficult thing to do, and we probably spent 6 months on this trying to get it right, and we ended up, this is the table that Bishop Michael used in the video that was presented to the Diocesan Council in 2010. And it looks like too much detail, and it is, but we just want to show you governance. If you can remember the PBMO, that was the organization from 1915 to 1967, excuse me, that ran the Japanese missions and the Chinese missions in the province. And you can see those two names at the top there. We'll go, sorry, the second one from the bottom, Alderman Halford D. Wilson, a member of that board from 1927 to 1942. There's been amazingly good research done in Vancouver and Victoria, professional academic research on racism in British Columbia. And she spent a lot of time on the time from 1905 right up to 1955, with a real emphasis on the 15 years before the Second World War. And the name that came up the most in all of that as being the worst purveyor of hatred in the Lower Mainland was that gentleman, Alderman Alfred D. Wilson. He was an alderman in Vancouver. He knew how to get re-elected. And the anti-Japanese sentiment in Vancouver was very raw. But it wasn't unique to Vancouver. It was up and down the entire west coast of North America. So the reason we put this slide up is if we're going to prove racism, you have to somehow show it. And Alderman Wilson was probably the worst of the worst. When they finally got him in the army, they actually moved him out of the province because he was causing so many problems in the middle of the war effort. So we think we convinced Bishop Michael so much that that quote you just heard from Bishop Michael, we devoted 3 chapters of this to try and understand, was it racism or not? And we believe it is, beyond a shadow of a doubt. You ask any Japanese Canadian, they felt it, they lived through it. But I think we were able to convince Bishop Michael that yes, that was the case, that we did have institutional racism at the very highest level of the executive in the Diocese in Westminster. Which makes a project like this an unpopular project. You know, that's a very hard thing to say about an executive council. But the bishop did tell us to be fearless with the truth. And so when we uncovered that, he encouraged us to continue to talk about it. So that obviously is our second R, is racism. The next one is timing, and this one helped us a lot in terms of understanding, was it racist or not? Going back to the date, April the 1st, 1949, is when everybody was finally allowed to come back to Vancouver. So this sequence of 5 events, you judged for yourselves how you would interpret them. So, April the 1st, 1949, people can finally come back, and by the end of the year, 300 people had. 22,000 people were exiled. By the end of that first year, and they came back quickly, we had 300 in Vancouver. So we call that day 1. That's our Genesis day. The second date, day 40. This is the 10th of May, 1949. And so this came out of the minutes of an executive council motion. We know the Japanese Canadians can finally legally come back. We know that they're back in the city. And what did we find in the executive council minutes? The Japanese Christians have left. Notice they didn't call them Anglicans. The Japanese Christians have left the coast and are not returning. They've been coming back for 40 days. The need of Japanese mission work is nil. The bishop had that particular quote put in the video that the diocese produced for presentation to the diocese in Westminster. That's day 40. Day 75. We have funds that have been in trust now for 4 years within the PBMO organization in trust for the Japanese Canadians who still cannot return legally. 75 days after they were allowed to return, over $5,000 of that money was transferred from the PBMO, from an in-trust fund, and it was transferred to the Diocese Westminster books and disappeared. Day 141. This is the worst of all from the perspective of the Japanese Canadians. And when we discovered this, we were scared as a team. There was great fear in the team when we discovered this, because nobody wanted to bring this to the bishop. But it's when we took this to the bishop and we expressed our fear But they sold the Japanese Canadian church 5 months after they're allowed to come back. And he said, well, you've proven those facts beyond a shadow of a doubt. It is irrefutable. He said, be fearless with the truth. And finally, the sale of obsolete buildings is not as important as when we move on to the Code of Silence. Did you have a quote in there?
And in his apology, Bishop Michael said, the sale in 1949 of Holy Cross Church was especially insensitive and wrong.
Code of Silence. This kept it quiet for 70 years, and this slide is intended to deal with really our conclusion, I guess, on why was it silent for 70 years? Why did this, how could this be suppressed the way it was? Why did nobody speak up? Why did it happen in the year 2008 instead of the year 1958?
This seems worse than the racial discrimination on government by wartime orders and council. This seems like virulent institutional provincial racism by our bishop and his executive council, hiding behind closed doors. In the early 50s, in front of Bishop Gower and Treasurer Mathewson, Reverend Timothy Nakayama asked what had happened to our 2 Japanese Canadian churches. He was given a one-word answer, relinquished. Gower and Mathewson had complete knowledge of all that had transpired, including the disappearance of our funds, but they would be no more forthright than relinquished. This was the beginning of a high-level pattern of being dismissive, less than forthright. This has continued for over 50 years to this very day. We are only now discovering the extent of their silence, of their sin of omission. Canon Tim Nakayama coined the term Code of Silence to describe why we didn't know until now about any of this. There is no doubt in my mind that he is right.
So Bishop Michael allowing us to present at Synod in 2010 and you allowing us to come here tonight is part of the process of breaking that code of silence. You know, the story of Lynn and the story of Joy and the story of 1,498 others is finally being told for the first time in a long, long time. So we're going to end with just a couple of slides with that picture back up and then we have a short video for you, but we really want to focus tonight. This is about the 1,500. There's a lot of people in the room with us tonight that we can't see. Because of that 1,500 Japanese Canadian Anglicans who were exiled in 1942, there's probably maybe 100 or 200 that are still alive. The rest of them have all passed away. But we pray their story will not be lost. We had a conversation with Lynn. I hope you don't mind me sharing this story, Lynn. And we said, our fear is as a team, when we're all gone in 20 years, that this story will die with us. And that would be sacrilege when you think of the memory of the 1,500. And Lynn was very pastoral and heartening, and she said to us, Greg, this story will not die. And that is our prayer tonight, is that the 1,500 will not be forgotten. As a church, what we did to them will not be forgotten, but that we will learn from it. The words that gave us the most motivation in the 5 years we've been working are those 5 on the right. And Bishop Michael told us to be fearless with the truth. And we're partly here tonight to ask your help in us being fearless with the truth, in helping us to tell the story of the 1,500 in any way you can help us. We talked about the 3 R's. You've probably all guessed them by now, I'm guessing. Certainly racism was one of them, reconciliation is the other, and relinquished is the third one. And it all twirls around April the 1st. So we have one final quote from Aunt Emily, and then we're going to go to a video.
Let that be the legacy of relinquished, the few, and reconciliation.